My name is Mae Brussell, and this is the beginning of a one-hour broadcast called World Watchers, program number 779, November the 10th, 1986. Before I begin the program, we want to thank Uncle Gaylord's Ice Cream Cafe for the patron grant for this program of World Watchers. They are open 7 a.m. until 11 p.m. at the Doubletree Mall in Monterey. They serve old-fashioned ice cream, fruit ices, and more. Nice croissants and goodies included in the more. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brings you the following hour of World Watchers. Well, this was some week. I was really excited about the week until I came in, and a friend of mine was in the studio who didn't seem at all knowledgeable about what in the hell was going on, and I assumed everybody knew some of the news that was going on this week that would make concerned people excited and understand a little bit about this electoral process that took place last week, among other things. I'm as happy as I can be. You may not see my smile, but you can tell it from my voice, I hope. First of all, the election results were fantastic just in terms of the Senate alone, except for Rose Bird in California, and I'm sure there were other events that were not so joyful around the country, but we don't keep up with those. It's all we can do to keep up with California, if we can do that, actually. The other thing that is so interesting is that Ronald Reagan has been pierced. That Teflon is gone now. His respectability, his credibility is gone. That includes among the Republicans, the Democrats, our allies, our enemies. They have one thing in common, and they have flooded the talk shows, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Reuters, AP, UPI, flooded with stories about Ronald Reagan, what he says as against what he does, what are the laws, and there are at least 4 congressional committees waiting to get their claws upon him when he returns to Washington and the Congress reconvenes again. Something was wrong in River City. He was the salesman who gave us all the lines that we wanted to hear, or he thought we wanted to hear, and suddenly, within just 2 weeks, everything is flopping around, and it is a tremendous change in scene that is going on at the present time. The third thing that makes me very, very happy and satisfied and appreciative to hear is the fact that the National Security Council is no longer a advisory committee that sits in the background that you never hear about. Up till now, you couldn't get information about them from Freedom of Information Act. Nobody from the Security Council is ever forced to testify. And the name National Security Council is heard now from coast to coast, and members of Congress are insisting that from now on, the head of the Security Council will have to be confirmed by Congress, and that they will have to tell congressional oversight committees what actions they are doing, because finally people got the idea that they are a private army. They are that hidden government that Fletcher Prouty wrote about in the book The Secret Team. They are the government I've been talking about for 15, this is my 16th year on the air, and they have taken the liberty with their 40 committee to kill any person, head of state around the world and in this country or elsewhere. 5 people make the decision and call themselves the 40 committee. The National Security Council has been named over and over, and I'm really thrilled that it has been exposed the way it has. I'm sorry the way it happened, but what goes around comes around, and it certainly did start coming around this week. Now, just to begin the broadcast, I want to just mention a few of the congressional changes that are so exciting. Most of you read the paper. Those of you that keep up with World Watchers, the idea of World Watchers, know these things. If you just depend upon me for your news, then I'm going to give you some of the things that have me very interested and excited. On October 25th, Ronald Reagan was campaigning, and he was blasting, in quotes, the liberal gang. He was making a 13-state blitz, and he said, in quotes, if the liberal gang regains the Senate, the nation can expect higher taxes, higher inflation, more crime, military weakness, indecision, attack on oil industry, and attack on free enterprise. Well, that was just about a week and a half ago. And now, announcing on programs such as Agronsky and Company, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, This new Congress, the Senate, intend to give no more funds to the Contras. They'll have no more judge appointees such as Mr. Mannion or even possibly Judge Rehnquist. They are going to lower the funds for Star Wars. They're going to override his veto on clean air. They are going to turn down chemical and biological weapons, and they're also going to put in fair labor laws and labor practices. The judiciary can call in Colonel Oliver North now from the National Security Council and find out about the funding of Contras that he has been spreading around. Reagan gave him the permission, and he's been doing it for 2 years, since 1983, spending $100 million on his own before Congress gave $100 million to the Contras. They can call in Mr. Gomez-Rodriguez. He's the associate of George Bush when Bush was CIA director. He's associate of Mr. Hassenfuss, who was arrested in Nicaragua. He's the man who killed Che Guevara and worked with Klaus Barbie and makes a cycle of the International Fascista. He can be called as a witness, and his name is in the paper, Mr. Gomez. The United States government has been giving Killer Gomez housing in Cherne, El Salvador, maintaining his domicile for a long time. Senator Strom Thurmond is out. He's no longer head of the judiciary, and we have Joseph Biden, who was on television this week assuring us that he would use the constitutional right as it was given to check and balance the appointment of justices that Ronald Reagan makes, that the Constitution allows the judiciary to pass and ask questions. Joseph Biden will be chairman of the judiciary. And also, the thing that I feared the most was that Ronald Reagan, as I mentioned before on World Watchers, would be appointing the new FBI director in 1988. And heaven help us if he had his own Congress and Senate stacked with the kind of appointments he's been making. So there's 4 justices over the age of 77, and the FBI director will come in 1988, and we will have a strong judiciary to handle it. Jesse Helms lost his handle on the right-wing base in North Carolina, and Governor Terry Sanford won that Senate seat in North Carolina. Paul Laxalt, the heir apparent to the throne in Washington, lost. His friend John Santini lost in Nevada as a senator. Ronald Reagan went there twice during the campaign to get him elected, and Nevada elected Representative Harry Reid instead. This is a state with mafia, organized crime, defense, nuclear testing, missile programs, military. So with all the far right wing of the mafia element, the Las Vegas gang, and the military, they didn't get the senator they wanted. The people voted for Representative Harry Reid, and this almost sinks the presidential nomination of Paul Laxalt because he couldn't even take his own state with his best friend. Senator Jeremiah Denton is out from Alabama. He was probably, it's a toss-up, the most reactionary member of Senate, a total war hawk, supported Star Wars. He was against senior citizens' rights, against labor, civil rights issues. He lost to Representative Richard Shelby. In California, Alan Cranston had a close race, but close doesn't matter. It only takes one to win, and he won over Mr. Ed Schau, whose campaign was promoted by people like Henry Kissinger and David Packard from the Silicon Valley. You know, the Hewlett-Packard Group were helping Schau try to make a Bobbsey twin out of Pete Wilson and Ed Schau. It didn't work. Cranston is in. Colorado was the biggest pull for Gary Hart. He wants to run as a presidential candidate. He gave up his Senate seat. Again, a military state, a lot Air Force base, a lot of military and very, very wealthy people in Colorado. And Reagan went there twice, and he offered them the goodies. He handed out Star Wars contracts. Vote for my man, and we'll give you the money for Star Wars. And he didn't get that either. Timothy Worth, the Democrat, won. Reagan wanted Ken Kramer. He said, if you give this one, give it to the Gipper. Well, there was a cartoon in the paper when he said that, and the person speaking with him said, yes, that's just what you got. Give one to the Gipper, you got one of the Senate seats that you wanted. This was a big victory for Gary Hart because he allegedly or possibly would be running against Paul Laxalt. So Hart has the support of his own state, and Laxalt's candidate didn't. And he's very, very close to Timothy Worth. I never heard Worth talk, and he was on the night of the acceptance, the elections, giving acceptance speech, and he sounded very brilliant, very capable. and everything sounded really good. He's a man who's strong for trade unions, peace movements, minorities in Colorado. He supports a nuclear test ban. He favors arms control agreements. In Florida, this is the election that sent Ronald Reagan to bed at 8 o'clock. His Senate pal Paula Hawkins lost. That was the first return of his defeat that came in. And she lost to Governor Bob Graham. She has one of the worst records in the Senate on arms control, labor, civil rights. She's known, they politely say, for exaggerating facts, which means a lie. She claims that her fame is tackling drug issues in Florida, and she's in the midst of the anti-Castro Cuban CIA drug dealers that she associates with in Florida. And Senator Graham, the new Senator Graham, supports social programs, environmental protection, support of labor, senior citizens, and so forth. Another hot potato that Reagan had was Linda Chavez, who formerly came out of the White House. Some of her dirty speeches, you could almost tell, were written by Thomas Buchanan. This is the Maryland race, and she lost out, terrible innuendos, one of the nastiest races. She lost to Barbara Mikulski, who now moves from the House to the Senate, a woman who's progressive. She's identified with the nuclear freeze. She's pro-education. She works Latino, grassroots, progressive with labor and working class. Governor Rhodes of Ohio got up through the primaries. That's the governor who approved of the Kent State shootings at the time of the Cambodia bombing on his campus. And he also protected Gordon Novell, a member of the Defense Department team who Jim Garrison wanted to question regarding the John Kennedy assassination. Governor Rhodes didn't win this election. There were some bad things, too. They weren't all good. Senator Alphonse D'Amato won again. He's a very strong candidate from close to the Vatican to the Grenada Medical School to the Korean airline, lies and propaganda. He had huge wads of money, outrageous hunks from the Wall Street area in New York City. And Arlen Specter from Philadelphia won again in the Senate. He's the CIA senator from the Warren Commission who created the fictitious Bullet 399 that allegedly killed John Kennedy. And he also lied in the investigation of Joseph Mengele and covered up the fact that Mengele did not die in 1979. One of the saddest things was that the people in California who voted for Deukmejian voted all the rest of the slate Democratic and then didn't vote for Justice Byrd. How they can let one man like Deukmejian make 3 appointments in one day for the Supreme Court is reprehensible. I'm not going to scold now, but that's the way it goes. Senator Ted Kennedy will head the Labor Committee, Labor and Human Resources Committee, where he says he can be effective in making changes there. And the Judiciary panel, as I said, will be under Senator Joseph Biden, who is very, very rigid. And then I must say that the ghost that will haunt everyone who comes to Washington at this point, to any any congressional meetings, when they hear Robert Kennedy Jr., it will absolutely amaze them to remember where they were in Dallas and to see him as he put social programs into effect. He won in Massachusetts. The elder citizen, Tip O'Neill, stepped down and gave it to the young Kennedy, started where John Kennedy, his uncle, began. And when you hear his voice, if you heard him the night of the acceptance speech, you see his father at the Ambassador Hotel on the floor, the hotel owned by David Schein, Roy Cohn's partner, cohorts of Richard Nixon, and you hear John Kennedy's voice. And I also know that Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon have to live like Hamlet and watch this character in the House of Representatives, and they must sometime look at each other or themselves and say, was it worth it all? That they did have an absolute part in the cover-up, if not the actual murder of John Kennedy, and possibly foreknowledge ahead of time, but working and protecting the assassins, and their careers were tangled in with the very people who killed John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. So Nixon had his problems, and Reagan's having the same problems, and to top it off, the icing on the cake is Joe Kennedy Jr. Now, before I get into the massive amount of news that is coming down, I want to put it into categories for you because I'll be covering these bases. Some I've started before, but there are 8 bases that will be in the news, probably 9, continuously through the entire next year. We're just almost there. And I will be doing large segments of these stories, and then I will be doing the related parts of the stories to each other that are in the news, and I'll detail them for you. But before I do that, I want to take time each week to update what I call one-liners. There's some articles that are too important to pass up. They have to do with past World Watchers programs or current news that's going to be important, or material I want to get into when I have more time and I don't want it to slip away. So I want to acknowledge, let you know that I'm aware of these things, but I want to run down a few items for you, 11 top stories, and then get to the other part of the program. The first is an article, there are many on the subject this week, but I'll just cite one for each subject, titled Challenger Figure Gets Top Shuttle Post, the San Francisco Chronicle, November the 8th. Arnold Aldrich, one of the highest NASA officials involved in the decision to launch the Challenger, was named director of the shuttle program. He's been appointed now not only to be one of the program advisors, one of the people who said go and turned down the advice of the engineers at Morton Thiokol. He has been made in charge of the entire shuttle program. He has been promoted, Arnold Aldrich. The second article, U.S. offers farms record cash plan not to grow grain. That's a New York Times article. The headline, it's a little wordy, but you'll get the idea. It was October the 24th. The Department of Agriculture wants to idle 10 million acres of farm in the United States. The taxpayers will put up $2 billion to not grow anything on 10 million acres of farm, nothing at all. The storage for surplus food this year is $1 billion, and they have to put on barges in the ocean, and some of it is just dying in the field. Where is Bob Geldof? Where are the hands across America? That's why I don't talk about those programs or participate in those programs, because they're street theater. They're so bad. They're so phony. They're so moment-to-moment activity, raising money to sell records. We are the world, and our government and our current president of the United States is putting $2 billion to grow nothing, and they're spending $1 billion to destroy what they have or put it out where nobody can touch it. That is total insanity, not only for the people who do it, but for the people who allow it. The third item is U.S. envoy blasts Pravda's linking AIDS to Pentagon. This is Washington Post. And I cited for you an article from Izvestia several months ago, the Soviet Union saying that the Pentagon is responsible for making the disease AIDS, which I think they put together at Fort Detrick, Maryland in 1971, started in 71, and there's a lot of evidence to support that I've had on broadcast. There was a cartoon in the Soviet Union of an American officer buying a vial of AIDS virus, and our ambassador to the Soviet Union was furious that they carry these cartoons and articles. The next subject, defense chief keeps ties to the United States with his eye on the presidency. This is Wall Street Journal, November the 4th. Field Marshal Abdel Halim Abu Ghazala of Egypt. Now, the reason I mention that is that this week, Mr. Abu Ghazala is noting that he wants to be the next president of Egypt. He's the fellow that visited Vice President George Bush, had lunch with him, took a plane and went back to Egypt, sat next to Anwar Sadat, who was murdered and gunned down. Abu Ghazala works with our Defense Department. He was trained in the United States. And the very week that George Bush is linked to illegal arms to Iran, the very week that George Bush is linked to illegal arms to the Contras, Mr. Abu Ghazala, I guess, wants to remind George Bush of what he knows about the murder of Sadat, and he lets Wall Street Journal know that he intends to become president of Egypt. The next item is Reagan made cleared of arms smuggling, and I want to do a lot on that later. This is a woman who rearranges Nancy's clothes and closets, that travels with her to foreign countries, who was the translator for a sale of 50,000 rounds of .22 caliber ammunition to go into dictator Stroessner's Paraguay. The men involved in the sale are indicted and will have charges. She said she was just the translator. .22 ammunition, 50,000 rounds would kill 50,000 people. in Paraguay, given the way they handle the bullets. Next item, key evidence in DeLorean defense case thrown out, the L.A. Herald. Crucial evidence involving a signature on a document is considered by the judge to be a forgery. It has to do with money that he took from the Cayman Islands to Swiss banks and involved with Colin Chapman of Lotus Car Company, who was murdered right afterwards, after these stories began to become exposed. The judge has thrown it out, and of course the control man for DeLorean is Gordon Novell, who worked with Governor Rhodes in Ohio, got protection from him, as I mentioned, the Defense Department babysitter for DeLorean, and he tried for his main defense to use what they said, judge said was forged documents. A book came out, I guess in the spring or summer. I bought it around the summer this year, called May Day by Michael Beschloss. It isn't a new book, but it's just coming out in England, and the Washington Times this week had an article. The headline is "U-2 Pilot Was Victim, Says Author," and it has to do with Gary Powers and the U-2 plane and how Powers was used for the Cold War to break up the meeting of Khrushchev and Eisenhower in 1960. The interesting thing is that the Washington Times, published by Reverend Moon and with Arnaud de Borchgrave as the editor, made notes that U.S. News and World Report carried segments of this book in the longest serialization of any book they have. Well, I had their reviews of U.S. News and World Report in the serialization, but I forgot to connect that Nicholas Daniloff, the person working for U.S. News and World Report in the Soviet Union that triggered the summit meeting, that awful summit with Ronald Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev, Daniloff was in the Soviet Union when Gary Powers had his trial, when Leon Marina Oswald were there, and I did 2 broadcasts on Daniloff and these connections. So it's interesting that the U.S. News and World Report had this long serialization of something that happened in Soviet Union in 1960, because I said that Daniloff set up with Mr. Taubman of the New York Times and the powers that be to duplicate the purpose to prevent the summit that Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev were planning for the early part of next year. Another article, Karachi hijacking linked to Lebanon rather than Syria, a long article from the New York Times. Reagan's terrorism is blaming Gaddafi and Libya and all the excitement of the election campaign, the shooting in Turkey of 22 Jews, the hijacking the day before, all this great agent provocateur activity. Now they cooled off a little in our allies, the Zia of Pakistan and that gang, and they say, oh yeah, it was someone from Lebanon. It wasn't Gaddafi after all. Another item, Star Wars traced to Eisenhower era. This is an interesting long news story from the New York Times with maps and charts, and it says that the ICBM started in 1958. Now, it took 40 years to admit that the Star Wars, the plan for the laser beams to scorch the earth and all that jazz, began in 1958 with our Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger. The truth is that Star Wars started in Nazi Germany, and it combined with various people in our Defense Department in the OSS as early as 1944, before the war was over, and when Eisenhower was a general running the war, the Star Wars idea to bring those rocket and missile scientists to the United States began when they buried their papers outside of Peenemünde, the rocket space scientists, Dornberg and von Braun and others, and used that as their ticket to the United States. Another item, Frank Sturgis says a watch scam was for the United States. Watergate defendant Frank Sturgis was arrested in Florida. He was selling stolen watches. He was helping prisoners get out of prison early by paying persons off. And when they picked him up, he said, I'm still an agent for the United States government. That's a Watergate defendant who served time in jail, and now he's dealing with stolen watches, and he says the government is still using him as an agent. Another item which is serious given the mentality of Ronald Reagan, Pakistan says it might request air patrols by the United States. That's New York Times. Reagan is getting closer to war. If he declares war, he's always identified with Franklin Roosevelt. He would stay in third term, get the Constitution changed or whatever it takes. And he's a very dangerous man. Next week, I'll share with you information I have. I talked with this Dr. Walsh last night. I had a long conversation with him and visited his offices in Beverly Hills. He's a psychiatrist who worked at Mayo Clinic for about 20 years, speaks 6 languages, and I met him because he had written items that Ronald Reagan wasn't mentally fit to be president of the United States, that he was psychologically sick, too sick to become president of the United States. He's the only psychiatrist who ever saw Rudolf Hess in Spandau prison, and he's well-trained, as I say, a linguist, and I spoke to him because I remembered seeing him before, and so many things that Reagan is doing now indicate a real mental sickness, and I'll do some of those with you later and run down my conversation with him, because I do not think he's fit, and I think he would like to start a war, and when we start circling Pakistan, we're awfully close to the Russian border. The San Francisco Examiner had an article yesterday, SS killed John Kennedy's brother. A newspaper in Germany said that Joe Kennedy Jr., the older brother of John Kennedy, was killed by SS troops July 1944 while trying to escape from his aircraft. He was interrogated by the Waffen-SS. A man named Karl-Heinz Wen gave an account of his interrogation, and then he was murdered. Now, the interesting point about this story is that by July 1944, Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS and Alan Dulles of the OSS in Bern, Switzerland, were already arranging with Heinrich Himmler and Richard von Weizsäcker, the father of the current president of Germany, for the arrangement of using Nazis after the war, incorporating them into America, American intelligence system, American army. And Joe Kennedy's ambition, his father's stated ambition when he was ambassador to Great Britain and in public life, was that he wanted his oldest son to become president of the United States. And after the war, the powers that be wanted Douglas MacArthur or General Eisenhower to be president, hopefully General Patton, who was murdered and wasn't able, he had that convenient car crash. But they wanted military persons to be president of the United States, and Joe Kennedy Jr. was not that kind of a person. His father was an avid, avowed Nazi, and was brought home by J. Edgar Hoover because he expressed so many Nazi sentiments when he was ambassador to Great Britain. You can have them, but you can't say them publicly. So it's interesting, at this time, 44 years later, the subject comes up about the Waffen-SS because the SS and the OSS melded as early as mid-1943. And when Joe Kennedy was brought in for interrogation, I'm sure he wasn't bashful to say, my father is Joe Kennedy, former ambassador to Great Britain, and so forth. And after the interrogation, or no matter, I don't know who they contacted or who they were in touch with, people like Prince Bernhard, he was working for I.G. Farben. He was in the SS, the Gestapo of Adolf Hitler, and he was allegedly helping the Free French and the Dutch resistance. And there's a book, Betrayal at Arnhem, that goes into the role of double agent of Prince Bernhard, and later he formed the Bilderberger Group. So this plane was shot down near Normandy, and whether they contacted somebody like Bernhard and got rid of Joe Kennedy Jr., I don't know. It's interesting, when John Birch was killed in China, he worked for the SS, and the people that formed the John Birch Society said that murder was the first bullet of World War III. But it could be that the murder of Joe Kennedy, which preceded it by a year or by 8 months, might have been the first bullet of World War III. There is a book called The Lost Prince, Young Joe, the Forgotten Kennedy. I have the book, and it tells the life of Joe Kennedy, the short life, and his ambition to be president, and so forth. And so it goes, a new story on the death of Joe Kennedy. Now, just 2 more items before I get to the other section of the program. There was a story this week in the San Francisco Chronicle and the U.S. Today. A Los Angeles company got a $10 million contract to provide Americans to replace Soviet embassies in Moscow. The Soviet Union kicked out their people that were working, and the contract was given to a company called Pacific Architects and Engineers. And imagine getting $10 million for drivers, workers, laborers, mechanics, and so forth at the embassy. Well, I got out my article that I wrote in 1974, Why Was Patricia Hearst Kidnapped? The SLA is the CIA, which is a book-length article published in The Realist, summer of 74, and it details the connections of the Defense Department, the CIA, the FBI, and National Security to the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. And I gave a biography in that article on page 11 about Colston Westbrook, who set up the entire SLA operation, and he worked for 3 years under Pacific Architects and Engineers, a CIA cover, the same agency that's going to send the help to Moscow to shovel the snow. We'll take a 1-minute break now because I'm going to speed along with the second half. It goes pretty fast when you have so much news to share. To get back to the employees that Ronald Reagan is sending to the Soviet Union, I described Colston Westbrook in my article, this was 12 years ago, as working, he worked for the CIA as advisor to the South Korean intelligence, to the Army, the Air Force, with linguistic training, with psychological warfare techniques, and then from February 1966 to September 1969, he listed his employment as administrator of Pacific Architects and Engineers, and they provided logistical support for the Phoenix program in Vietnam. And then he came home and went to Vacaville Prison, where he worked with agents that I wrote about in the article that were from the Drug Enforcement Agency from Indiana and people from the intelligence community in California, and formed the nucleus of a group of people that were to go into the prison systems, and then they murdered Dr. Marcus Foster and then kidnapped Patty Hearst. And it was a tryout for Ronald Reagan and Mies for their what is known as the Garden Plot, what to do in emergencies. It was the first time the SWAT teams were introduced publicly for America, and they surrounded a house and sent a firebomb and burned 6 people during the dinner hour, the SLA. But the company that is being used to refurbish the help in Moscow is the same company that Colston Westbrook used for 3 years in Southeast Asia. And just to update, there's 2 other quick items to remind you of. I've been talking about Mordecai Vanunu, the scientist, the atomic scientist, the neutron bomb scientist, who was kidnapped, taken out of Great Britain, and the Israelis identified him as being in their prison, and they said, we have to come forward because the whole world knows it. Anyway, yes, we have him. But they announced on national television just this last Sunday evening that their trials can be secret, their sentences can be secret. You may never know if he gets sentenced for life or death penalty. And the scandal, as I've said all along, is not the showing pictures of the atomic energy, the atomic bombs that Israel has the capability of making, but the London Times story that broke September 30th had to do with Israel's neutron bomb. And that was just a month after the Cameroon excursion, where Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres was in Cameroon with the president of Cameroon, and our Defense Department flew in people to work and examine the bodies. And I believe that that was the first test. Well, the first mini test of neutron was in Cameroon in 1984, and the findings of that are still locked up. So that Mordecai Vanunu is in the middle of that. And last week I talked at length of trying to locate who the 4th person was on the airplane with Mr. Hassenfuss in Nicaragua. There was a small item in the U.S. News November the 7th that the 4th passenger, the 3rd dead crewman with Hassenfuss in Nicaragua, was named Freddy Vilchez Blandon, Blandon, identified as a Nicaraguan. It doesn't say why a Nicaraguan would be on a plane with 3 people from the CIA and the Defense Department, but the Nicaraguan embassy in Washington didn't have the name of the person, and I'll pursue and ask other news media if they have the name, because as far as I've called, they don't have the name, and there's only been one sentence in one paper that I take that has the name of this particular person. Now, as far as the news that's gushing out, I will be updating segments of it or spending almost entire broadcasts on parts of these news events, but they're coming out so fast that I just wanted to delineate the major stories in this remaining 20 minutes so that if it appears I'm jumping around, I have a pattern that I want to follow. If you send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511, Carmel 93922, I will send you a bibliography sheet that I have with each program and a list of subjects that I will be referring to each week the problem now with this news is that these items that I'm going to list with you, 8 or 9 of them, must be dealt separately as separate subjects, but then they almost have to be connected throughout the programs with each other, because that is the point of having these broadcasts, is to tell you the relationship of agents and people that are not put in the various news accounts. They tell you of separated events, but very seldom make connections. When I wrote Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped in 1972, there was so much news coming out about Watergate, and I wrote a 3-part article, one on who was involved in Watergate and why they were there and how they got there. And the second part of the article was the links of Watergate going back to the end of World War II, the Nazi connections, and the Kennedy assassination. And part 3 was how Nixon really came to power in his career in Navy intelligence and supported by aerospace, mafia, and Nazis, because the Watergate didn't stand by itself. There was a continuity of the people behind him and then ready to push him off the bridge, at the end of the line and get ready for Spyro Agnew when these presidents are not to be shot and are not usable anymore, like the old pirate plank. The system moves them on and has somebody waiting in the wing that they have already selected. And I believe this has happened now, and that what you're seeing is a continuation of Watergate. Because the Kennedy assassination was never solved properly, anybody with a good brain and a willing ear could sit down and be told exactly who did it in not too long a time period, but it has not properly been put together because those people selected and investigated are part of the cover-up. The Kennedy assassination has never properly been exposed, and because Watergate inquiries were limited as to motives and the real people behind them that go to the Kennedy assassination, and because Ronald Reagan's career from Warner Brothers to governor to president and his links to very important people related to Watergate and to the Kennedy assassination has never been put on the table, just as a surgeon cuts a body for an exploratory and looks at the organs. All of these things have been churning, and visible and invisible pieces of the government merge when somebody makes an event happen and there's a deep throat. In fact, Richard Allen, the former Security Council advisor, said on Crossfire this evening that you can expect some more leakage of what is going on now, that it's going to continue, and I think that's what they're afraid of. Now, the first and biggest story of the week, of course, is the arming of Iran. The Ronald Reagan using the National Security Council. He bypassed Congress, the CIA, the State Department, the Defense Department. A friend of mine was in the station here talking to me just before the program went on, and he talks about politics and reads books. And when I mentioned the Iran thing, he says, so what? You have to get the hostages out. And I really couldn't believe that we had a bombardment of every major news media for the entire week, and that somebody wasn't tuning on and picking up these things who is intelligent, or I thought was intelligent. I just cannot believe how people are willing to say, well, each hostage is worth $16 million. We paid $16 million for the 3 that got out, and then they picked up 2 more after that. So that's $48 million for 3 hostages and a lot of weapons to Khomeini. And the scandal of that has been just absolutely floored the arch conservatives like Robert Novak and people from the Security Council, State Department, and so forth. Even they are disgusted and angry and hurt and confused. And I can't believe that most ordinary people can accept these events as being ordinary activities. The fact that the President of the United States has been arming Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran for 18 months, and he's telling every country we don't deal with hostages. He runs a campaign, I'm not like Carter, and I don't make bargains, and nobody has a price. And he tells France you can't arm Syria, and he tells Great Britain you can't buy anything or get anything for Gaddafi in Libya, and he's telling various countries, China, you can't arm Iran. And then it turns out they've had Israel arming Khomeini all this time, and it's just disgusting. And if you didn't follow it from the day it first broke, I guess it's hard to catch up, but that's one of the big stories that will be going on, like the Teapot Dome or Watergate. This Iranian story will never erase from American history. It's not a so what. The Congress had said there was an embargo on sending weapons to the country of Ayatollah Khomeini because of the terrorism. And the president gets a group together in the National Security Council and sends arms to them. It's not a so what. Nothing like this has ever happened. And the national security is that agency that I said that offsets the checks and balances of the Constitution. And now they've been caught 2 times in 3 weeks doing just what I said they've been doing for the last 16 years. The second big story is the Nicaraguan air crash of Eugene Josephus. And again, Congress said you cannot send military aid to the Contras, and Ronald Reagan calls in the same people and decides that, oh, sure, we can. So March 83, he meets with these people. The common denominator between these activities is Admiral John Poindexter of the National Security Council, Mr. McFarland, formerly of the Marines, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, Vice President George Bush, who's linked to all of them, and Israel was supplying Iran for us as soon as Reagan was elected. And the implications are tremendous here, because did he promise Khomeini right in 1980 that he could start getting arms if he held up the hostages until Jimmy Carter lost the election, until the day he was inaugurated. And these items I bring up to you are summaries of the news, and then I'm going to detail them at great length later in later broadcasts. The fourth item, the Nicaraguan air crash, is a scandal of George Bush linking to the murder of Che Guevara, to working with Klaus Barbie, the Nazi international fascista. The other scandal is the arming of Congress of Contras by the National Security Council with those agents, and also John Singlaub is the common denominator, and I'll mention more about him in a moment. The fourth big scandal is the pressure of Margaret Thatcher to tell countries that Syria is a terrorist country, that you have to stop sending arms. And she had the economic group in Europe saying we can't send arms to Syria. And what got in her craw was the fact that an airplane, the El Al Israeli airplane, had a passenger on it, a woman whose suitcase had a bomb that was picked up on the machine, and she went bananas that the Syrians used Great Britain for terrorism, for something that never happened. And she screams and yells, and she's used to terrorism, and the plane didn't blow up. It was a terrible thing. But I'm going into detail again, the use of London, in London, Reading, England, of a Mr. Shipuri, who heads the Pakistani group that want to form their own separate, not the Pakistan, the Sikh group, that want to form the Khalistan government. And I want to go at great length in a few weeks again with Jagjit Singh Chohan, Chauhan. I don't think I pronounced it right, but we'll say it's as close as I can get it. That's a London-based organization of the Sikhs, and their headquarters are in Ecuador with the Mossad, again with Israel, with Great Britain. And Margaret Thatcher isn't mad that on November in 1985, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was murdered by these people celebrating in the streets and offering money to murder her, or that Air India went off thanks to these people, where over 350 people were killed. Margaret Thatcher is not against killing and blowing up Air India. Why did she care about El Al that didn't blow up? I mean, she over-responded to something. And again, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and Israel are doing what they want and cutting off countries and telling other people to do it and selectively using their terrorism. But the important thing about the Sikhs in London is that they use American aid money from Pakistan and Afghanistan to send narcotics down to Ecuador, where they work right next to and with the old Klaus Barbie cocaine connections that were forced to move from Bolivia. And when Lyndon LaRouche accuses the Queen of England or the British of being in drug traffic, he details in his newspaper the connections in Ecuador to the Mossad, to Israel, to the Middle East narcotics, and to blowing up planes, killing people, and tying in with the Nazi Fascist International, which again cuts in and connects with the Contras down in Nicaragua and George Bush's teams. Another area that is not over yet, far from over, is the summit meeting, and I will be updating articles on that. It is still one of the most important areas. It will be on the history books and the agenda of things to study for years to come. It was hastily called. We still don't know why Mr. Gorbachev met Ronald Reagan, what they said. Reagan says one thing and Gorbachev says he's lying, that somebody else controls America. We don't know why Nicholas Daniloff's arrest triggered such a response on the part of Ronald Reagan that he had to run to Iceland. We don't know much about Nicholas Daniloff except that everything in his profile is military intelligence of the highest level. This was a very important meeting, and of course Ronald Reagan will not barter away Star Wars. That was Edward Teller's baby. And again, the National Security Council that's been charged with running their army in Nicaragua with the Contras and sending arms to Iran. The National Security Council and Mr. Daniel Graham, former Defense Intelligence Agency, and the notorious Fritz Kramer, Kissinger's mentor, and Edward Teller put together the Star Wars script for Ronald Reagan in March of 1983, March 23rd. And at the time Reagan gave the speech about Star Wars, the Pentagon didn't even know about it. The government that worked with the rocket scientists in Peenemünde in Nazi Germany, with Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger and their heirs at Huntsville, Alabama, the ones that ordered the Challenger to go, even though it was being tested in the coldest weather and would surely blow up, and then turn the space shuttle program over to the military. These people concocted a Star Wars script because they've planned Star Wars going back to 1943-44. So the summit is very, very important. I have at least 150 important articles on the summit in the past 3 weeks. It's that important. Another big story to follow continuously again is the story of the Israeli atomic scientist Mordecai Benunu, and I will pursue as hard as I can the fact that I believe that the Cameroon killing of 1,700 blacks was a testing of the neutron bomb, and that will be in the news. And this non-trial, the secret trial in Israel, isn't going to stop that, because there are other papers and articles that keep printing, particularly Spotlight, Liberty Lobby. They do it because they're so anti-Semitic. Willis Carto keeps printing about the neutron bomb and the seriousness of the neutron bomb with Israel having it. They haven't yet made the connection to Cameroon. That has yet to be done. That's a subject that I have been hitting upon. And another subject that I'll be updating, that, and all of these link together. If you make chains or circles, all of these subjects that are in the news are important. And that was the request for another is the request for a special prosecutor to investigate why the Challenger, the space shuttle, went up on the coldest day of January 28th, when it was warm 3 days before and the same afternoon afterwards, and who ordered the launching of the shuttle. And a special prosecutor can, in fact, be assigned now, because the judiciary has made a complete flop. And that's what's so exciting about the news this week, the change in the judiciary, where none of these people would be called in if Strom Thurmond were chairman. Mr. Joseph Biden won't hesitate, and the committee won't hesitate to possibly have a special prosecutor. And if they're going to call Mr. Gomez and all these other characters, Lieutenant Colonel North, then they're going to request an investigation of the space shuttle. And finally, the House election, the changes in the Congress, I want to detail more. I just hurried through some of those areas tonight because it's timely, and I do want to tell the significance of the various committees, and particularly when they get to Washington, so that you get an overview of what happened. On the talk show part of my program last week, a woman called up and said she wasn't going to vote for either of the parties. It didn't matter. I think you get from what I said this evening that it mattered a hell of a bean, that they're not going to go along with German biological warfare, using genetic altering as a new weapon. They were so excited because with genetic altering you can make better weapons and clean up the toxic air and get employment for people and cut the funds for Star Wars. As I listed those things, it mattered a lot. And not only did good people get in, but they were intelligent people. And the exciting thing was that while all this Contra stuff was coming down and the Iranian scandals were coming down, I heard intelligent people talking on the television for the first time, and we were told the Democratic Party was dead. It was over, and all of a sudden there's a two-party system, and everyone in Washington on all the talk shows or news stories are amazed how alive it is, and it's alive and kicking, and it will hold all the committees, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House of Representatives, but not just the old Southern Democrats that drag their feet. Some very, very concerned people with elegant, intelligent minds. You know, you wonder, is there intelligent life on planet Earth? And yes, it's out there. It really is there. I heard it the whole past week, and I was really thrilled about it. Now, the common denominator between all of these activities is General John Singlaub. I use his name many, many times, and as I talk about these 8 different major news stories, and also I meant to include the terrorism in France that came to an absolute standstill when it was connected to Francois Junod, the agent for Adolf Hitler, and Martin Bormann and all the top Nazis, the man who hired Jacques Birch as the attorney for Klaus Barbie. As soon as George Abdullah got Jacques Birch as his attorney, and George Abdullah, the terrorist of the Paris bombings, was linked to Junod in Zurich, Switzerland, you haven't heard a word about terrorism in France. It came to a standstill. You can talk about the Red Brigades or the Baader-Meinhof, and as soon as you find out it connects to the far right-wing intelligence, like the SLA is the CIA, then it disappears from the face of the earth. You can't let those systems of agents provocateurs get into the news. Once they're there, they sink like a bunch of dead weight into the ocean, and you don't hear any more about it. The news media are basically, they're afraid of change, and they don't want to tell you when it reverses. If it's a leftist, you hear about it. When the left turns out to be a Nazi, then it disappears from the news. Now, getting back to Singlaub as the hub of the wheel, I mentioned last week that he was fired by Jimmy Carter when he was stationed in South Korea because he disagreed with Jimmy Carter's not wanting the neutron bomb. And, of course, that ties into the Israel, Cameroon, and Alexander Haig pushing the neutron bomb. And I'll be doing more on Haig next week. Singlaub is president of World Anti-Communist League, which is the international connection of death squads, and the Operation Condor. And hopefully I'll update Condor, the Nicaraguan Contras, Mr. Hassenfuss, and the people related to Hassenfuss, and tie it again to the network of Otto Skorzeny and Reinhard Gehlen after the war. Singlaub represents the World Anti-Communist League. He also represents the National Security Council. He sat there with Ronald Reagan when Reagan hired discussed and put the wheels going with Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, with Mr. McFarlane, with Admiral John Poindexter, with George Bush, and he's the one who could disseminate $100 million illegally against the laws of Congress and call it humanitarian aid when it was really weapons, and they used half the cash they can't account for narcotics and gun running, and Congress is going to open that up as soon as they reconvene again. Singlaub started the Soldier of Fortune magazine, as I said. He put Robert Brown from the Marines in charge of that, and that is the organization that recruits mercenaries to do the work for the National Security Council. As they say on television these past days, Ronald Reagan had his own army. It's supposed to be an advisory committee that was active. Singlaub on the board of Western Goals, and I wrote about those connections at the time of the murder of Larry McDonald on the Korean airline, and also on the board is Edward Teller of Star Wars, and we make a full cycle. All of these people connect, these different subjects that are in the news connect with each other, and I'll bring them up. And Singlaub is the main sponsor or part of the American Security Council. The National Security Council was put together in 1947 as a branch of the executive government, and I'll go into details of how that was formed and what the charter was on the National Security Council, now that's in the news so much. The American Security Council was set up by the FBI and persons from the Bureau, J. Edgar Hoover's Bureau, and the far right-wing conservatives, and they formed that Georgetown Center for Strategic Studies. They're the think tank for the National Security Council. They are identical twins. They have no function as part of the American government, but they are part of the Heritage Foundation, the Coors family, and all the right-wing activity that takes place in this country is under the umbrella of the American Security Council. So I'll be sharing that with you. Now, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal that I want to share with you before this hour is up, just to give you an inkling of how the news is breaking at this present time, because this is not a trial balloon. When the Wall Street Journal has an article like this, you know pretty well that Ronald Reagan's time is up. I mentioned last week the possibility of impeachment, and this is the article. It's titled, "Reagan's Fondness for Covert Action Threatens His Activist Foreign Policy." Written by John Walcott. The Reagan administration's penchant for substituting covert action instead of foreign policy, is threatening to revive the partisan squabbling that crippled the United States policy. It paralyzed the Central Intelligence Agency and the Pentagon 10 years ago. The Democratic leaders of the new Senate have promised to begin digging deep for the secrets of the administration's policies towards Iran, Libya, and Nicaragua. If they want to dig deep, I'll send them some outlines. The press already thinks it smells Watergate-style abuses of presidential power, while the congressional investigations coming as a wide-open battle for presidency begins could unravel the fragile consensus that has favored the activist foreign policy that Ronald Reagan struggled so hard to create. The fragile consensus. That was his pals from the polls and nothing else. How else could these elections have turned out the way they did? The article goes on, if that happens, however, the president has mostly himself to blame. Time and time again, he has turned to covert action to carry out policies that Congress would never support, as in Nicaragua, or from his own advisors when they didn't agree in Libya or Iran. The fondness for clandestine activities was encouraged by CIA Director William Casey. Casey came from the OSS and with Reinhard Gehlen and is a Knight of Malta, and he thinks he's a lord unto himself. He encouraged the president. And the article goes by, and the president's national security advisors, they have unnerved both the Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of State George Shultz. They have rattled the professionals in the CIA and the military. All of them remember that one lesson of the Nixon years is not to get involved in policies. The public doesn't support them. You shouldn't get involved with them. They have to be popular or you're in trouble. Particularly, they can be unpopular, but they have to be legal. When they're unpopular and illegal, you're really in trouble. It is Mr. Reagan's self-assurance and his visionary nature, the very qualities that made him an effective leader, that got him into trouble. He isn't one to quit doing what he thinks is right simply because Congress or the cabinet won't support it. And this is part of the symptom of his being mentally sick. In Central America, for example, Congress's refusal to provide aid to the anti-Sandinista rebels in Nicaragua prompted Mr. Reagan, this time with broad support from his advisors, to use the National Security Council, keep away from prying congressmen, claim executive privilege, carry on his secret war against the Sandinistas. In Libya, the administration's problem was different. From Mr. Reagan's first day in office, his advisors didn't know how seriously to take Muammar Gaddafi. They received multiple intelligence reports that said he might assassinate the president or use as officials, and that was all wrong intelligence given to him. So he turned his action to covert aid, and that boomerang. If Mr. Reagan's instincts provided the motives for his activities, the presence of the National Security Staff of a veteran covert operator, Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, gave a unique opportunity to run any operations he wanted out of the old executive office building. Colonel North is a gung-ho veteran of the covert operations of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and the press has an interest in the administration's clandestine activities that are focused on him. I have to jump down here because our time is up. The article concludes by saying covert action is no substitute for popular support or for a consensus within the administration. If the president and advisors were gambling that their policies would set in motion a Congress that would rally behind him later, they have lost. The damage is enormous. By making U.S. policy once again a partisan issue, the president may have undone the one thing he wanted most to do, to restore America's ability to act decisively on the world stage. He has neutralized every bit of that, and it is very exciting to see that Mr. Phony Baloney has finally been exposed by his own party, by his own friends, much less his enemies. Now, this concludes the World Watchers program, and before I finish, we want to thank Uncle Gaylord's Ice Cream Cafe for this patron grant.